Recording.
Okay.
Hi guys, Kira Namaste. So this is Samara, and I'm here with my very good guest, Lawrence Krauss, who is a well-known physicist, a brilliant mind, and he has written plenty of books that all of us can read. So I thought I'd start by asking, some very important questions. And so my first question is, Lawrence, I noticed that the bulletin of atomic scientists, they are making an announcement on the Doomsday Clock on the 24th.
Yeah.
Now, are you optimistic about it? Are you pessimistic about it? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think at this point it's hard. Well, I've written that I think the constraints of the Doomsday Clock now make it very difficult to for the clock to register something that's accurate in the sense that right now as we used to say when we used to do the clock meetings, there's uh, there's very little real estate left on the clock, and therefore we it used to be 5 minutes to midnight or 7 minutes to midnight. We could move it a minute or two, but now that it's less, it's
Right.
less than 2 minutes. It's really hard for them to move, and therefore, unfortunately, I think issues about real estate will enter their discussion and determination as much as issues of reality. But I suspect with the situation in Ukraine, um, I suspect they'll leave it the same, is my bet, because they're going to say that the situation in Ukraine is is very scary, and perhaps as scary as far as the use of nuclear weapons as we've been in a long time. That may cause them to move it forward 10 seconds, and that's always a possibility. They may say that the pandemic, the ability to create vaccines and the pandemic and control the pandemic was a good thing. So maybe they'll move it forward 10 seconds to argue that the Ukraine overwhelmed the danger of Russia using nuclear weapons in the Ukraine overwhelms other positive things possibly. Um, uh, so yeah, and as far as there are three things that enter into their decision probably. One is, well, four things. One is nuclear weapons. The other is bioterrorism, and the third is sort of the use of AI or the dangers of AI, or at least false news and that sort of thing. Um, I think I suspect the dominant issue that will be driving their decision will be the situation in Ukraine, and I'd be very surprised if that doesn't dominate the discussion. But as I say, at this point, I'm not sure the clock. I've kind of lost confidence in the clock as a
Oh, I
particularly
see.
useful metric, although I certainly applaud the goals of the organization.
Sure, sure. And I mean the thing is, someone like me from the outside, when I look at the clock and I go, well, there's 2 minutes, or however many minutes left, it's a very scary thought. And I remember, when the announcement came out, I talking to some of my friends, and some of them are obviously concerned, and they want, they care about what the clock says. But then there's a large group of people who are not concerned. They don't even. It's something that doesn't even enter their world.
Well, I mean, that's part of the purpose of the clock. One of the reasons I got involved, there were a number of reasons I got involved in the organization. I was very honored to be chairman of the board of the board of sponsors, which was created by Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, and so I was very happy to follow in their footsteps for a while. Uh, I think the idea of raising this issue enough to at least
Hmm.
maybe scare people, but at least get people's attention for one day a year about the dangers. It used to be just the dangers of nuclear weapons, and then we expanded it to other existential threats. The fact that it gets some people's attention and causes them to think about that is a positive thing. Uh, um, the clock itself as a sort of scientific diagnostic, it was never meant to be that. And
Okay.
every time I used to get interviewed about it, we'd have to make it clear. But but I think the notion of at least trying to encourage some more people to and maybe using this I hate to say it, this scare tactic to get more people to think about the real dangers, existential dangers that humanity faces. climate change, and that, by the way, that's one of the other big issues that they'll talk about. And climate change is also in the negative direction. Yeah, so given Ukraine and climate change, my bet is it'll move forward a little bit. It'll move forward 10 to 20 seconds. Um, but it's important that people realize these are big existential threats. And the main purpose, I think, is to, if it's useful, is to get people to discuss this and maybe to look up the information. I mean, a scare tactic is useless unless people can look up information. And one of the things about the bulletin is that it provides a lot of information. So, so I think on the whole, it's a positive thing. I think the clock itself, while it's been a wonderful metaphor for 75 years, I'm not sure its utility persists, especially, and I'm partly responsible for this because when I was chair of the board is when we broadened the discussion beyond nuclear weapons to include climate change and
Right.
bioterrorism and AI. But they're all very different kinds of threats. And with nuclear weapons, you can sort of pinpoint a danger and an immediate danger. But in terms of those other things, they're longer term threats that it's harder to quantify with a clock type bit
Right.
of symbolism. Yeah.
Right. And I guess I remember going to your one of your talks in Auckland a few years back, and you quoted, I think, Cormac McCarthy, and you said, being pessimistic is no reason to be gloomy. So I guess that's still your outlook.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think being gloomy is particularly useful to anyone.
Right.
Uh, Recognizing and keeping your eyes open to the situation is fine and should be, and maybe a spur to action. But just moping as a result of it is only as someone said. I think it's like regret is suffering twice or something. But I mean, it's
Right.
just sort of punishing yourself. And
Right.
um, I think what we should do is recognize those challenges and try and speak out and do something to make the world a better place if we can. And also
Right.
enjoy the fact that, there's so many positive things about life that we shouldn't forget. So
Yeah.
yeah, I thought Cormac's response was perfect.
Perfect response. And thinking about the things in life that are positive, you've said that the universe is indifferent to us,
Yeah.
um, and but it doesn't stop us from looking around and seeing the beauty of the universe. So I guess the question really is, uh, are you being nihilistic about the universe, or are you saying something bigger than that? Are you saying
I'm not
something?
being nihilistic. I'm just saying the universe is, I mean, it's a supreme act of solipsism to assume the
Right.
universe is made for us or cares
Right.
about us. And so to recognize that nature does what it does is just reality.
Right.
And to pretend that the universe is looking out for us relinquishes the control we have that we should have on our own lives. So I don't think it's nihilism at all. It's saying that it's not saying that there's no meaning in the universe. It's saying that we make our own meaning, and
Right.
it's up to
Right.
us to act accordingly. But it's just
Right.
realism, and I wish more people realize that, because if we assume that there's some great guardian taking care of us, then people don't want to act to take care of ourselves.
Right. And yes, I don't. I mean, I'm personally not very religious myself, or believe in a supreme
Hmm.
deity, or in creation myths or things like that. But one of the things I've noticed is that when it comes to climate change, a large group that is involved in the fight are the indigenous people, and I guess
What?
that's interesting.
A large group are what?
The indigenous communities.
Uh-huh.
And I guess it's interesting because you when you think of the indigenous people, we think of creation myths and stories like that. But it seems that they're happy to reconcile with science, and they're happy to, I don't know, work with scientists when it comes to climate change.
Well, yeah, I guess so. I think there's a double-edged sword there. Indigenous groups are obviously much more sensitive to have traditionally been more sensitive to obviously geographic changes because many of them have traditionally lived more closely related to the land and therefore have a closer connection to the things that are changing as a result of climate change. That's the positive. The negative, I think, is that sometimes indigenous groups claim that indigenous myths are somehow equivalent to science,
Right,
and that I think is unfortunate. So it happens both ways, I think.
right. And I guess that's the point where which I wanted to ask the question of um, science versus religion. I mean, we all know your stance on this issue, but has have you changed your stance recently, or do you feel that you've made some progress with the religious people on when it comes to science? Have you made progress with them?
I don't know if I've made any progress. I think I like to think I've had some positive impact in getting people to accept the world the way it is. Um,
Right.
my goal is not to attack religion as much as to get people to recognize the reality of the universe and enjoy it without all the
Yeah.
necessary myths and fairy tales. Um, but I don't think my view has changed, except to realize that traditional religion is not the only source of problems. I mean,
Mm.
dogmatism in any form is a danger, and of course, religious dogmatism is something that we've focused on a lot over the years. But there's now kinds of secular dogmatism that is very similar,
Right.
where saying words is heresy and requiring people to adhere to notions without being able to question them. Those which have been typical of fundamentalist religions are now more characteristic of a lot of actions in the secular community. And so I think my focus in some sense has been to speak out against those travesties, having spent many years speaking about the religious travesties. And so I guess my focus is to think less about religious nonsense, except every now and then when it rears its ugly head, and more think about the other nonsense that's impacting, and more relevantly, probably and myopically, that's impacting on academia, where I spent many years of my life.
Right. Right. And in regards to the question of uh, religion and in regards to the question of science, what I find interesting is that, like you said yourself, it's not just religion. It's also the secular side that's become more close-minded. And I guess one of the things I've noticed is that on social media and things like that, now Facebook does a thing called fact checking, which is a good thing, maybe, and a bad thing, maybe. I don't know, because there are people who have been blocked for spreading misinformation. But at the same time, there are certain topics where it seems to me that Facebook blocks people or prohibits them from speaking.
Hmm.
Um, so what are your views on social media, where
Well, well, I think my views on social media that I mean, social media has good things and bad things.
right,
It's it provides many people an opportunity to get information they wouldn't get otherwise, but it's also
right,
misinformation. And I don't think censorship is generally a good idea in any case.
right,
I think we
right,
have to train people to be able
right,
to distinguish sense from nonsense, and we have to do that better in schools.
right,
But if you censor things, enforcing your rules imply who the question is who gets to do the enforcing, and
right,
inevitably, maybe someone you agree with today, but tomorrow it might not be.
right,
And so that's the problem. I mean, free speech, and I've often quoted Christopher Hitchens, although he wasn't the first one to say this either. Free speech is not to protect the rights of the speaker so much as to protect the
right,
rights of the of the a person who's listening to be able to hear something that might change their mind.
Right, right, right. That's a very interesting perspective.
Sorry, my dogs are barking because someone's coming in the door, but it's okay.
Right. I see. Yes, that's a very interesting perspective on the issue of free speech being there to protect the right of the listener as opposed to the speaker.
Yeah,
And speaking of free speech, it seems to me, and I'm shifting gears a little bit towards, well, if I haven't, well, I guess I have already done that. Talking a bit more about politics, it seems that whilst free speech is something that I cherish myself and I respect and support, there are people who use free speech in order to defend, I guess, hate speech. Now, what is
yeah.
your view on that?
Well, I guess my view is that speech is not. I grew up in an era when I was in the playground in school, and we used to say when people called us names, we used to say sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me.
Right,
So I don't think words are
right,
um, a form of words can hurt, but you have a choice of how you react to it,
right,
and I don't think of words as violence so much.
right.
Advocating dangerous policies. I mean,
Yeah,
advocating and people go out and kill people or something is dangerous, but that's illegal, and they're already,
right, right,
that's already protected in a sense. So I guess I don't see the need to add things beyond that. I
right,
think we have to just what we have is a society and culture. People are just too sensitive to feel victimized,
right,
and if
right.
so hate speech is awful,
Yes,
but it's awful, but it's just a reflection of the small-mindedness of the speaker, and the people who are the brunts of the hate speech can choose to just they can choose on how they respond to it,
right,
and 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 um and to say I'm victimized and I'm traumatized and I'm hurt for the rest of my life because someone called me something awful. Well, I just think that's beyond the pale.
right, right. And one of the questions that I like asking intellectuals like yourself is, whichever field that you are working in, whether it's physics or politics or something else, I've often wondered, um, could you have taken a different path in a different universe? Could you have taken a different path where perhaps you're working for Wall Street? And I've asked a few people this question because I sort of feel that they could have chosen a different path where they would have earned more money, earned more prestige. I don't know, but would you have considered, or did you consider such a path in life?
I considered a lot of different paths when I was younger. There are a lot of different things I wanted to do, and
Right,
I've been fortunate to do a number of them in the context of the path I've chosen. I didn't expect to be able to do all of the things. I've done a number of the different things I wanted to do. I've been lucky enough to do even anyway. But of course, I consider lots of options, um, and I think it's a good thing to not, to keep them open as long as you can in one's life. And in fact, now that I'm retired, I try to do some of the things that I didn't do when I was full-time job in academia. And and so yeah, who knows what would have happened if I chosen one other path? And I suspect there are many different paths that might have been rewarding, but I feel quite lucky that the path I chose has been as rewarding as it has been.
right, right. And we enjoy the fact that scientists like yourself, they are writing books, they are educating us, they are giving us knowledge. So I really, really, I mean, I for one can say that I really appreciate the fact that you chose the path of science, and in the path of science, I guess again the question, you could have become a biologist or you could have chosen a different type of science. what exactly drew you to physics? What was it about physics?
Well, I think it was a combination of books by scientists, books by
Right,
physicists. But I realized that at the time also the recognition that it seemed to me that physics was the most fundamental thing and exciting aspect of trying to understand how the world worked, combined with, unfortunately, the fact that when I was growing up, which was a long, long time ago, biology wasn't particularly interesting. It wasn't
right,
taught in an interesting way. It was taught as memorizing parts of frogs or memorizing
right,
terms, and I hated memorization.
right.
Um, and and um, and of course, in retrospect, biology has become incredibly exciting and interesting, and in some ways, um, I like to learn more about it and wish I was doing it maybe because it is an incredibly exciting field. Um,
Right.
and so I think it was just a product of my time as much as anything else. And reading books, turns out the books that were written back then were primarily, not completely, but primarily by physicists, or sometimes physicists who'd done something else. I mean, after all, the
Right.
DNA that Watson and Crick both were. Crick, in particular, was a physicist, and Watson was, basically shifted into that field. And as
Hi guys, so welcome back to the interview I have with Lawrence Krauss. Last time our interview got cut off due to technical reasons, but now we are finally back together and ready to discuss a few more things. So Lawrence, first I wanted to ask you is if you don't mind me asking, we'll go back to physics, I guess. And the question I wanted to always ask is about the very beginning of the universe. When everything was in as I understand it, before the Big Bang, everything was in a very, very extremely tiny state, I guess you could call it. So how does
Well,
one imagine that? It's so, for me, it's really hard to imagine something like that existing.
well, it's hard for anyone to imagine that, but it's not quite what you said. First of all,
Right, right,
it's not before the big. There's no before the Big Bang.
right,
The Big Bang is defined at the beginning when everything. If we take the equations of general relativity that as we now have them and extrapolate them back, then at t equals zero, the universe was in an infinitely dense state. Our observable universe was an infinitely dense state in a single point. We think that's probably not true, that probably quantum effects change that. But
right,
what we do know is that there is no that is t equals zero. There's no t less than zero in that picture. There's no before.
right,
Now, question is there a before? And the answer is we don't know.
right,
But there doesn't need to be. That's the key point.
right,
And there could be in a multiverse, if you want to call it that, or a metaverse, there could be some global time, and our universe originated at that instant in that global time, and we
right,
measure time. But that's only assuming in some sense that it's embedded in something else. As I described in a universe from nothing, it's quite possible that and quite likely that our universe spontaneously arose, not in that infinitely dense state, but in a very dense state, still extremely hard to imagine, smaller than the size of an atom, with all of the energy in all the 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars contained in that region. It's unfathomably dense, and we it's amazing that we can even talk about that with any kind of straight face. But
right,
but uh, but it uh, on those extremely small scales, we have to consider quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, if it's applied to space and time itself, allows for spaces and times to pop into existence, and that can happen, and that could have happened in our universe. And as I've described, if you asked what would be the characteristics of a universe that survived for 14 billion years, that spontaneously popped into existence from nothing, the answer is it would look just like our universe. So now,
right,
is that absolutely not? But bottom line is it's hard. I mean, we can extrapolate mathematically. Our equations take us back to a certain time, and we can choose to believe them all the way back to t equals zero, or acknowledge that they probably only apply up to some point close to that point. So mathematically, we can do things, but physically, to imagine that is impossible. I mean, it's just such an exotic state that it's so foreign compared to anything we've ever experienced.
right, right. And do you think? I mean, do pardon the fact that I am not a scientist. I'm not a physicist, so I'm just wondering, is there a possibility that there could be an alternative? In a few decades, maybe or longer, we find an alternative to the Big Bang Theory. Do you think that could be possible?
No, no, I mean, look, the point is that there's things we know and there's things we don't know. My new book is, in fact, about things we don't know. And when it comes to
Right.
things we don't know, anything goes in some sense, almost anything goes. What doesn't go is that which violates what we already do know. And we do
Right.
know the Big Bang happened. We can extrapolate back and test our ideas back to the time when the universe was at least a second, if not a millionth of a second old. Now, for earlier times, we can't directly yet get observables that allow us to test our ideas. So you're absolutely right. In the first millionth of a second, it could be quite different. But from a
Right.
millionth of a second to today, nothing's going to change. And
Right.
so we
Right. Right.
those ideas work. Now, the first millionth of a second is a very important time because it involves the formation of our universe. And as I describe in my new book, in fact, what's really weird is because physical phenomena, the rates at which physical events happen, goes up exponentially with higher and higher temperature. You can actually calculate that more events occurred in the first second in the history of the universe than will occur in the rest of the future history of the universe. So the first
Wow.
second is probably the most interesting time from a physics point of view, although
Right.
perhaps from our point of view, the first second is remote. But so bottom line is we're arguing about a very small amount of time, what happened in the very first billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a second. Obviously, it's fundamentally important because conceptually it addresses our understanding of what some people would call the creation of the universe. I would like to call the formation of the universe. But and in that sense, we have no real theories. As I've given you a plausibility argument, but we don't know because we don't have a theory of quantum gravity, which is what we really need to be able to testably or even non-testably define exactly what happens. Our laws of physics, as we now understand them, are unworkable at a time very close to t equals 0, and therefore everything you argue about at that time, and a lot of people argue about a lot of things, is based on plausibility or inference or suggestion, but not definitive physical theory.
Right. And do you think we'll get a theory of quantum gravity?
I have no idea. I don't make predictions for such short times as
Right.
less than a million years, as I like to say. I think it's anyone's guess. I mean, some people think string theory is on the right road. It
Right.
seems to have wound up in a morass of mathematical difficulty and no obvious progress that I can think of towards understanding the early universe. In the last, there was a great deal of progress in string theory in the first 10 or 15 years, and then it kind of got bogged down in realizing the theory is much more complicated than people thought. So whether it has anything to do with reality, we still don't know. But it's the best bet. But I don't know if we'll have a theory of quantum gravity in this century or this millennium.
Right.
It
We'll see. We'll
requires
see.
ideas and some hard work and a lot of people working hard. And maybe. But what's nice is to have something that leads us in the right direction, usually experimental phenomena. Many people think black holes, at least thinking about black holes may be the key because black holes produce many paradoxes. And if we try and resolve them, maybe we'll understand more about quantum gravity. And, a
Right.
lot of people have talked about black holes. And I talk about a lot in my new book, but there's still, a lot of it that's still just supposition. And we'll wait and see. I mean, until
Right.
Einstein came, it wasn't clear we'd have a theory of general relativity, although I suspect someone else would have derived it in that century.
Right. Right.
Hilbert was close. But although it was really more than anything else that Einstein did, close to the work of a single person, close to anything I know of in physics that came from almost pure thought, although he was motivated by empirical arguments. But and quantum mechanics was a surprise, but it came about because of a physical paradox. And so generally our new ideas come about trying to understand physical phenomena. And unfortunately, when it comes to the beginning of the universe, we don't have any real physical phenomena except that the universe exists. And so
Right.
there's nothing that we can use to test it. So as I say, some people think the last moments of black hole collapse are somewhat similar physics. So maybe we'll understand, that'll help us understand something.
Right. And is it, making progress in physics? Is it? I mean, there's of course the hard work, but is it also a question of funding, and is it also a question of money? I mean, considering that a lot of government spendings and things like that go to areas that perhaps they shouldn't be going to. So is it a question of funding?
Well, it's, I mean, it's not, who knows? I mean,
Right,
one thing is clear is that I don't think we'll make any progress if we stop empirically exploring the universe. And at the
right,
smallest scales, that generally means high energy particle accelerators.
right,
Now, we have one going now, the Large Hadron Collider, and if it doesn't come up with new results, we will have to look for new ways to probe nature on those scales,
right,
and that will cost money.
right,
And we have the wherewithal and the foresight to spend that money is not clear. But that's the forefront right now from the point of view of experiment, and right now it is funded. The U.S., of course, was originally building a machine and didn't fund it. We would have had the answers to those questions 20 years earlier if the U.S. hadn't canceled their projects. But I think we have to wait and see what comes out of the Large Hadron Collider before we say what's the next best step. People are designing new accelerators, but whether they'll ever be built is something I don't know. When it comes to the sort of general relativity and the theoretical issues, a lot of it is just pen and paper and computers, and I think that doesn't require the same level of funding. Of course, looking out at the universe for astrophysical phenomena, which right now provide us the best tests of fundamental physics, that requires money, but I think there is that money for new telescopes, and we have the James Webb
right,
Space Telescope.
right,
So right now, I don't think money is the chief obstacle, but it will maybe in the next decade or two.
right, right. I see, I see. And changing gears a little, I guess I wanted to talk to you about your meeting with Jordan Peterson. And the reason I bring that up is because I guess, with Jordan, there are people that love him, there are people that don't love him, and I sort of fall into the other camp. I'm not a big supporter of Jordan Peterson.
A lot of what he says is complete nonsense. It's just, I guess I think what's important
Right,
um, is to point is to just because a lot of what someone says is complete nonsense doesn't mean everything they say is. And in some areas, I think he does make valid points. And moreover, I agreed to do it largely skeptical, but our conversations were informative and cordial, and I found his
right,
interest in understanding what I was talking about to raise my opinion of him as an intellect,
right,
and why we did a second podcast. But
right,
that the fact that we've done two podcasts together too doesn't mean I think a lot of what he says is he often says things without thinking about them very deeply, and when you question
right,
him, he does recognize sometimes that he's wrong, but he makes these statements, and he's caught on in a way that happens in popular culture, and for things that for some parts, as I say, I agree with him. I'm concerned about some things that he talks about. Other things I think are just complete and utter nonsense.
So what are the things that you do agree with him on?
Well, I'm concerned about the infringement of being able to of free speech. Basically, we
Free
both
speech?
concerned
Okay,
about that in
sure.
academia and elsewhere, and I think that's one area where we resonate completely. And the concern that people have about being offended,
Right,
the need, the requirements basically the constraints on free speech. I think that's the area where he and I agree most, and the threats to academia and industry that are being
right,
imposed by the demands of political correctness are something that we agree on completely.
right. And what are the things that you don't agree on?
Almost everything else.
Almost everything else.
Well, the nature of climate, the science of climate change, of which he understands
Right,
nothing. Um,
right,
uh, and 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 also the appropriateness of requiring in a social contract in the middle of a pandemic, requiring people to behave in a way that in principle threatens the health of other people the least. So I have no problem with I didn't feel my life was infringed by being required to wear a mask
Right.
Even if the efficacy of masks is not 100%. Similarly, vaccinations, throughout human history, vaccinations have been a way to deal
Mm.
with fending off viruses, and I have zero doubt that millions of people's lives were saved by vaccinations. Now, to
Right.
the
Right.
extent which you mandate it and require it, that's a interesting issue of civil liberties. But on the whole, I think I'm not a believer. I'm more of the Rousseauian view of that we all were born free, but we live forever in chains. That we sign a social contract when we're born, whether we want to or not, and we're not completely free to do things. And if we choose not to be vaccinated, I don't think we force people to be vaccinated, but if we choose not to be vaccinated, then in certain cases we make that choice, recognizing that it's a compromise, that we give up other liberties by doing that. And that's something I have no problem with, but I'm certainly he does.
Right. Right. And in terms of climate change, I actually did go to one of his talks in Auckland, New Zealand, when he was here. And one of the things he said was that the measures that we are taking right now to combat climate change, they are sacrificing billions to save millions in the future. Now, do you agree with that, or what do
Well, I
you
don't
think?
see any evidence that we're sacrificing billions right now. I don't see any evidence of that
Right,
at all. I think on the whole, new technologies tend to benefit economically societies.
right,
And I think it's important to make a transition that's gentle, but new technologies can be implemented in a way that create new opportunities for entrepreneurs and society without destroying the economy. And I don't see any evidence that the Canadian economy, for example, has been destroyed. But and by not having unfettered access to tar sands in Alberta, I'd say. I think it's all a matter of of balances, but there's zero doubt that um, that working towards new technologies to reduce CO2 production is a good thing, and the question is how we do it.
right.
But talking about saving millions, I mean, one doesn't know, and certainly he doesn't know, but one cannot adequately predict exactly how many billions of people will be impacted. There are possibilities, there are realistic possibilities that literally billions of people will be negatively influenced by say rising sea levels in the next throughout the century. And at different levels of certainty, depending upon the level one talks about with sea levels. But that's a real concern, and and just to slough that off as if it's unimportant is to
Mm.
be ignorant. And I think in this case, he's ignorant.
Right, right. And of course, he is also, as I
Dogmatic,
understand,
dogmatic, which I think is his big problem. I think he
right.
tends to be dogmatic. He thinks in certain cases deeply, and I give him credit for that part. But when he comes up with something, I think he decides that that's it. And it's hard. I mean, we went in non-threatening conversations. I've been able to, I think, change, at least get him to agree that certain things or certain ideas may not be correct. But otherwise, I think when he tends to be dogmatic, which appeals to the masses, I think on YouTube and in
Mm.
auditoriums.
Right, right. Of course, yes. And I mean, when I was at his talk, of course, the fans were going crazy. They were applauding a lot of things that he says, including his religious beliefs.
Yeah, well,
Um,
we've discussed. I mean, yeah, we have very different view about religious beliefs, but we talked about them in a respectful way. I think.
yeah.
I think he because of his psychological background, he has this belief that myth is somehow deeply intertwined in our being, and therefore the myths that we have are central to our existence. And there's I don't think they're hardwired in the same way that he does, but that's where he's coming from, and I understand that's where he's coming from, although I disagree with it.
Right,
I do
right.
think I think it's more culturally, our myths are culturally derived, and they are deeply ingrained in us because of the society in which we're born. And we may be hardwired to want to have myths. That's no doubt. That's not I'll buy that. but that doesn't give them an objective reality.
Right. And last question from me is your meeting with Johnny Depp. I thought that was really an insightful talk, and Johnny's an interesting character. So
He's
how
very
did that
I
come
want
about?
to highlight him as a deep thinker, which most people don't think of, but I know from
Right.
long friendship with him how much he reads and thinks about things.
Well, he had to be a deep thinker if he's taking on characters that are so
Well,
complex.
I know, maybe. I mean, I don't know if that's an a priori requirement, but
Right.
it could be intuitive. But he does read and think deeply, and it's both thoughtful and gentle. And I wanted to highlight all of that.
Right. Right.
I mean, it was a great act of trust on his part to appear on stage before 3,000 people with me in an
Right.
open-ended discussion. And he's very shy.
Right. Of course. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Lawrence, for your time. I really appreciate the fact that you came on for a second time.
Sure, I'm sorry we had those problems the first time,
No,
but I
no,
hope.
that's all right, and thank you again, and I hope your travels went really well, and your travels go really well
Thank you. Well,
for
I
the
had
rest
the
of the year.
same winter issues of air travel, but I survived them eventually. Just
Yeah,
annoyances more than anything else. But yeah, no, it was anyway. I hope to be uh, when the new book comes out, I will be in England. I'll be doing some events in England
right,
and
right, right.
in May, the end of May, and I hope we'll see if I do any events in North America. That's open right now, but I'll definitely be doing some events in England.
Any chance of coming to Australia and New Zealand? Any?
There are two sets of people have asked me to do that. I would love to do that again. I spent a lot of time in Australia and New Zealand, and so there are some discussions about maybe coming at the end of this year, but they're
Right,
just early discussions. I would love to do a tour of New Zealand again and Australia, and the new book is a good time to do it. But whether that actually materializes will depend on the people who are willing to organize that and whether they're willing to. I had a tour that in the past was going to happen and was canceled. So we'll see what happens this time.
I see. Well, if you do get a chance to come down to Auckland, it would be awesome
You're not the
to
only one.
come
I've had
attend.
3 people in the last week, two of whom claim they're going to organize something. So we'll see. I'd love to go back. And there's a writers' festival, and I forget when that is.
Ah,
We should,
yes.
when is that? I've
Uh,
been,
it's sometime in the middle of the year. Sometime in the middle of the year.
well, you
So,
can suggest it to them. Since my new book comes out in May in
oh,
Australia.
gladly,
So
yes.
go ahead and suggest it. If they want me, I'll be there.
Awesome. That sounds really good. And thank you again for this interview. And I hope you have a really wonderful day
Thank you.
and
You
a
too.
great
Take
week.
care. Okay. You
And
take care.
awesome. Thank you. All right. Take
Sure.
care. Bye.
You take it. Bye-bye.